in 2022, the U.S. abolished the federal right to abortion access with the Dobbs decision, overturning Roe v. Wade. And many of the activists and leaders that I work with within WRJ will say to me, I can't believe we have to do this all over again, right? They have worked tirelessly for access to basic rights of bodily autonomy for women and people who can become pregnant to have the ability just to say, this is my body. There's amazing conversation in the Talmud. I'll get the citation, but there's this conversation back and forth where rabbis are arguing about a woman's body, and like the sort of final sentence, of course, male identified rabbis, and the final sentence is pshita gufahi, like it's her body, like just like let's end this discussion.
Welcome back to the Pluralist podcast from both sides of the ocean. We are recording today on International Women's Day, a moment that invites reflection on the progress that has been made for women's equality and the work that still lies ahead. Today, we are really honored to be joined by Rabbi Liz Hirsch, the CEO of Women of Reform Judaism, the organization that for more than a century has mobilized Reform Jewish women to advance justice, equality, connection, and growth. Liz, thank you so much for joining us.
Orly, Josh, thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
Wonderful. So maybe we want to start with sort of your personal story. And if you could tell us a little bit about your own connection to Israel, how it has developed over the years, whether there is like some kind of an formative experience for you that influenced your relationship to Israel, that shaped your leadership today.
Yes, I think, when I think about my own journey and deep connection and now where we're standing sort of in this moment and the opportunity that I have to lead WRJ and to be a leader in our movement at this moment, like for me, it all starts with having many formative experiences spending time in Israel. So I don't have any immediate family in Israel, so I wasn't going to get there for family reasons. When I was in high school, I went on a semester program. The Reform Movement semester program is now called Heller High. It was then called the EIE Eisendrath International Exchange Program. And now, of course, Josh and I are great colleagues and friends and work together on what we do. But that's actually when we met is, Josh, did you make Aliyah in order to teach our semester, or were you coming at the same time and it helped to make that happen?
I was invited to teach, and I said, this is the moment. So I said, I folded up life and came on Aliyah, and it was nice to come with a job, and it sort of went hand in hand for me. But that was 22 years ago, Liz.
Yes. I know. And what was amazing about that semester, right? You came and they needed you to come because there were so many of us. There were 66 of us who were coming that semester, all from different Reform congregations and communities, or got connected in some way. And we were just immersed. And that being my very first time in Israel gave me the groundwork and the foundation not only to, learned about the different biblical sites, right? Yediat Haaretz, I think, was really like the knowing of the land was the frame of what we did in that program. And also just to have positive connections, right? And associations, and to begin making the personal connections and meeting Israelis. So then my goal just, throughout life was to get back there, to get back to Israel as often as possible. I studied at the Arava Institute on Kibbutz Keturah, which is a peace and coexistence program. Israelis, Palestinians, Jordanians, Americans lived on a kibbutz together and tried to solve all of the issues of environmental conflict and also of the Middle East conflict. And, just along the way, having those experiences. When I finished college, I worked as a legislative assistant at the Religious Action Center and was assigned the Israel policy portfolio. And that was really the first step in that I had working with Rabbi David Saperstein, Rabbi Eric Yaffe, and many of the other leaders in our movement at that time. Unlike the rest of the Religious Action Center legislative assistants who spent more time on the Hill, I was working more on the international policy side of things and got that real taste of things. And I think, this is why I think after October 7th, many folks say, we had no idea what to do. I equally, like everyone else, I didn't know what to do. But through those connections and through that foundation, I felt a sense of comfort and confidence in the decisions that I was making and the way that WRJ was leading to sort of the next choice and the next choice based on that foundation.
And I think through there, you may have also gone to rabbinical school and
that too. And there for a year, right? Yes, exactly.
And spent more time in Israel.
Yes.
It's a really beautiful story about how you've woven in both the connection to Israel, Zionism, Jewish peoplehood, with also social justice issues, and really trying to balance this. Whether we spend a lot of time talking about Israel as a Jewish and democratic state and what that means, and you've really embodied the, especially with the Arava Institute, and especially, like, we could edit this out, but like, Liz, I remember you coming up with like, hey, in my spare time, I just came up with this like, really cool flowchart of how the reform movement should restructure at 15 years old.
Yeah, I still have it, Josh. I found it.
Oh my God. You have to say,
Yeah.
you have to, make that a PDF or something like that. You have to save that. But no, but it's really amazing. And where I want to take this is to say, when you came into the leadership position of Women of Reform Judaism, I feel like it was a conscious, strategic, and, deliberate decision, or an ideological decision to say that Israel is going to be a big part of WRJ's work. And first of all, I couldn't be happier about that, of course, with, looking at it from my lens. But how is that going, essentially? And how are you looking at it from a leadership position? And how are members of WRJ really navigating these conversations about Israel today, especially during such a complex political moment, which has been complex since the moment that you began?
Yes.
I think, yeah.
I started just, in the summer of 2023. And I think that, something that I think that folks sometimes lose track of, especially around the bigger or perhaps generalized or stereotyped conversations about where the reform movement was at. Now, I'm only speaking historically on Zionism and on the state of Israel. And the UAHC didn't come out formally on the record in support of Zionism until the 1940s. WRJ's first policy resolution saying that we were in support of folks who were living in then Palestine, of course, as it was called, was in 1915. It was one of our first ever resolutions that we voted, and we were focused more on education and women and aid, but we voted to send aid there. And this is somewhere I'm like fascinated to do the research, right, on
It's
sort
incredible.
of what enabled us to think differently. But I think we've always had that undercurrent of the ways in which we connect to Israel and Zionism is through people, right? We care about the personal connections. And I mentioned that I don't have any immediate family in Israel. That's the case for a lot of our members and our leaders, and their connections to Israel are through our reform movement family, right? They feel that connection to the rabbis and the congregations, and Orly, to you, to the leaders that are in Israel. That's what, weaves us together. So that's why we've been making sure that we get to Israel when we can since October 7th, and that we think about those connections as personal and real people that we strive to help and to support. And of course, thinking about women and all of those aspects too, but I think it's more just about our deep ties and connection, and in some cases, the grant support that we give to different organizations in the flourishing reform movement in Israel.
And of course, it should be said that WRJ played a major role as activists in the World Zionist Congress elections, which was really critical.
And that was new for us, Josh. I think that's something that's it to have that kind of an active role, to have folks on the slate to be organizing. And that's something that came out of us knowing that we were positioned in the moment to do it. And also that because we are the umbrella for several hundred sisterhoods and women's groups that are located at Reform congregations throughout North America, that we could also do the organizing and work on turnout for votes as well, too.
It's really amazing. I mean, the whole, the whole work, and with the historical perspective, I want to really zoom in and sort of dive in to talk a little bit about women's rights. We mentioned that we are recording on the International Women's Rights Day, and we know that specifically on this issue, we've come a long way, right? There's so much that we already achieved, really worldwide, but there is still so much more to be done. And I want to sort of ask you, when you look today about women's rights, specifically in the US, we'll talk a little bit later about Israel. What do you see today as the most pressing issues around those issues? And what do you think should be done? Sort of what are your priorities when we're talking about women's rights?
Yes, I want to speak about the US, and I also want to make sure that I speak about Canada because we represent North America, and some of those issues are a little bit different in Canada too. And I'm just back from a really meaningful visit with Holy Blossom Temple in Toronto. And of course, we're thinking about the congregations that just in the past week have been impacted by anti-Semitic violence in Canada simply for representing their values in Zionism as well too. So, I think in the US, in particular, our key issues that WRJ has that we're working on are voting rights, abortion access, and gender-based violence. And we selected these issues. This is a collaborative process where our leadership in our social justice area think together about what are the issues where we can both have the most impact and that are most pressing for us. So when we think about voting rights, we know that women and Jews and all minorities are actually safest in democracies, right? And if we think about sort of connections between what's going on in Israel, what's going on in the US, women and Jews and all people are safest in healthy minorities and in healthy democracies, sorry.
Right.
Like that's where we are making sure that people's rights can be preserved. So we're making sure that people have access to voting and working with a number of different national but also local opportunities for that as well too. Abortion access, it has been one of our top issues. Again, we've been on the record on that topic since 1935. And in 2022, the US abolished the federal right to abortion access with the Dobbs decision, overturning Roe v. Wade. And many of the activists and leaders that I work with within WRJ will say to me, I can't believe we have to do this all over again, right? They have worked tirelessly for access to basic rights of bodily autonomy for women and people who can become pregnant to have the ability just to say, this is my body. There's amazing conversation in the Talmud. I'll get the citation, but there's this conversation back and forth where rabbis are arguing about a woman's body, and like the sort of final sentence, of course, male identified rabbis, and the final sentence is pshita gufahi, like it's her body, like just like let's end this discussion. So that's really what we feel about it. We've been working WRJ together with the Religious Action Center in the States on state level ballot initiatives that will hopefully bring back abortion access protections state by state and to build out the patchwork that way. But it is a patchwork. I live in Cincinnati, and we are the first place that if you start driving north from Florida all the way north on Ive, all the way through up to Cincinnati, and for folks less familiar with the US map, we are in the middle of the country where you can get legal access to an abortion if that's what you need. So you just imagine the people, the women getting in their cars and just driving and driving until you hit Cincinnati. It's unreal. So we're working on all of these pieces, and I framed it as access in particular, just to note that, while abortion is legal in Canada, I have learned from our partners there that access in rural areas in particular can be challenging if it's just sort of the distances that people need to travel in order to get to a provider. And I'm glad you spoke and asked me about these issues, just because on April 12th, WRJ is convening a North American Day of Action. And by convening, I mean participate from where you are. We are hoping that everyone in local communities, I think we have a couple hundred events that people have agreed to host, that you can take action on these different issues. And we can hopefully have an impact in all of our local groups and sisterhoods and women's groups. And of course, I regularly work in coalition and come to the Hill to lobby on these priorities as well.
That's on all three issues, right? Or only on abortions?
All three of those issues. So groups can say, like, we want to focus on voting rights. We want to focus on gender-based violence. We want to focus on abortion access.
So, it's interesting because when I look at Israel, and we'll talk more in detail soon, abortion is actually one of the issues which is up until now, we hope it's not going to, turn into an issue, but it is not an issue for women here in Israel. I mean, we have so many other issues facing women, including, by the way, gender-based violence, which has increased dramatically under this government. up to the point that Israel is on the Global Safety Index for Women. Israel is now located 83 out of 181 countries. So the situation is very bad. But on the issue of abortion, it's a non-issue, which is so weird for a country that has such an amazing, a really strong religious influence. And despite that, it's very different. So I think the forces trying to limit and restrict women's rights are different in this sense, and they have different motives. And this could be part of the reason that the issues are not the same in both countries.
Yeah, Orly, I think when we speak about, a lot of the different women's rights work that you are leading on and inspiring us every day with the work that IRAC does and that WRJ is so proud to support and advocate on as well too. A lot of it is less about access and more about erasure, right? About women's images, their voices, their presence being erased from the public sphere. I'm sure we're going to speak about the Kotel, right? So I think that a lot of these are, not about sort of the restriction of those rights, like we're talking about abortion access here in the States, but sort of the way that women can have a public presence and an active role based on the way that the government is shaped by a lot of the ultra religious forces.
Well, look, it's really fascinating, just to hear the different issues that you're working on and how those are all, coming into play. And Orly, I want to, get your take on how some of the differences are how they're playing out differently in Israel, and how we as a reform movement, both approach them in North America and in Israel and around the world. But Liz, if you can, Orly asked us to zoom in, and I want to ask us to zoom out for a second and to show where have we made some progress and where have we not, and even, dare I say, as you mentioned with regarding reproductive rights, where have we gone backwards? And to look, sometimes when we're in it and we're looking up close, it's sometimes it's hard to say, well, things are the worst that they've ever been ever, and you're like, well, actually we've made quite a bit of progress on some issues, and some and sometimes we haven't. So help us understand a little bit about progress versus stagnation or even regression, dare I say.
Yeah, our frame that we take is being established in 1913. We trace all of the waves of feminism that have happened throughout the US and Canada. Our founding is very tied up with white women, and I say white women in particular, getting the right to vote in the 19-teens, 1920s in North America, and moving
The
all
whole
the way
suffrage movement and the
right, and stuff. Exactly. So we take that long sweep of remember when just over 50 years ago, women couldn't become rabbis, right? Remember the different ways in which so many women have been firsts in their field and stepped up in that way, and the long sweep of history and that progress that we've made. It still doesn't change the fact that we're living in one of the times, I think, where there is so much regression and restriction in terms of women's rights, health, and access. But that's why I love hosting the podcast that I host called Just for This, where each week I bring on, and Orly, it was wonderful to have you a couple seasons ago, women in leadership to talk exactly about these issues, because we talk about both the progress that women have made and the ways in which women are stepping up into leadership roles and how that makes an impact, and also the real barriers and challenges that we still have in lots of different spheres. And I've come to see that one of the most impactful things about the podcast is both women sharing the specific ways in which they've made advancements, the ways in which, as we discussed together, that we're limited, but also it's that see it to be it frame that happens of just to bring on, and I really, view it as in the best way, a parade of women leaders to folks to say, you can see yourself in this leader. You can see yourself in this person. Women who are looking to role models of amazing lawyers and advocates and social justice leaders in Israel or around the world are going to have listened to Orly's episode and say, maybe that's something that I could do. And I think we find in every type of case that when people see that there's someone else who has been out there and leading and may be someone who can even open a door for them, then that's how we really begin to change the situation in society.
I think like my take specifically on the issues of women's rights is that the huge progress that we made is really raising awareness for women and girls and for society as a whole for the need to fight it. You know, that there is this theory of change that three American scholars developed in 1981 called Felstiner, Abel, and Sarah, that spoke about, you know, naming, blaming, and claiming. You first have to name an unjust phenomenon. You have to understand who you need to blame, and then you need to go and claim your rights. And I think in Israel, and I think it's probably true worldwide, a lot of people, specifically on what we have been fighting with really generous support of WRJ for many years, our fight against exclusion of women and gender segregation is for people to first give it a name, right? And we gave it a name. We gave it the Hebrew name Hadarat Nashim, exclusion of women. This is sort of a name that we actually coined more than 20 years ago. And people started to understand that there is a problem with it and started to see sort of the whole picture, that it's not like one thing here and one thing there. It's a whole context of discriminatory practices that try to erase women, as you mentioned before, and also exclude them and prevent them from using public services as their male counterparts do. And it took us a very long time to actually educate the Israeli public and to explain to them that this is something that should not be respected or tolerated in the name of some kind of a multiculturalist claim. And I think that at the beginning, you know, it started in Israel with our fight against segregation on buses. You know, when women were sent to the back of the bus, this is unbelievably still happening. Like you said on abortions, I can't believe that we're still fighting this, right? It's only 20 years, but still. And at first, you know, at the beginning of the 2000s, when we started dealing with it, people told me, like liberal, secular Israelis said, well, why do you fight this? You know, maybe we should respect this way of life. And it took a long time for us to explain to people that, first of all, it hurts Haredi women, right? It hurts a lot of women, and including women who were supposedly agreeing to do that. And also it affects all of us, and it affects society as a whole. And I believe that during this last 20 years, we made such progress, Josh, to your question, in the sense that today it's like across the board understood that this is something that's illegal and should be fought. And that's, I think, a huge development, despite the fact that it still continues to some extent. But I think, I don't know if you see this same, you know, in North America about the raise more awareness of people of the need to fight it. And that's a huge step forward.
Yeah. I also think that, you know, and Josh, with due respect, right? When you and I show up in spaces, like my existence as a woman and a rabbi is viewed differently from many.
100%.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, so already starting out sort of from a different place of privilege, but I almost use that as an opening to say, like, so I'm already starting from a place of this is who I am and what I represent is not going to be in alignment or agreement with many of the folks that I'm interacting with. And then to move that into a space of public voice and public protest, right? I was thinking about a time when the judicial coup protests were going on, and I was in Tel Aviv, joined our reform movement partners and congregations that were holding Havdalah ceremonies, like just adjacent to going into the protests. And women were playing guitar and singing and leading and holding the title of rabbi. And then we marched in together and said, the very thing that we were doing here, that we want to be in the public square in the way that we want to be in it. And so much of it is tied up in women's leadership and voices and representation, that's what we're actually marching in to stand for and to represent that. I feel that when we're at the Kotel, I feel it in all of those different spaces, is if we start from a place of, if we want to exist in the way that we want to not just pray, but also to lead and to raise our voices, then we know already that purely existing is a form of protest.
Yeah, and existing. And I think, you know, the joke in the reform movement in Israel is that, you know, okay, I guess men can also become reform rabbis. You know, it's
I do want to say something about that, because, you know, it is still a phenomenon that a lot, you know, we have more and more Israelis who are looking for reform rabbis to officiate their weddings, right? Or bar bat mitzvahs. It still happens, and it's quite common that families would contact the congregation and would say, we want a reform rabbi, but we want a male reform rabbi. Okay, so that's like one step too far if it's going to be a female reform rabbi. And this is something that happens really all across Israel, including in very liberal spaces. And it creates a dilemma, right? It poses a dilemma. Well, should we accommodate this, or should we say, well, And I think most places do accommodate this because they're saying, okay, let's give them the liberal religious services, but it is very painful, right? Obviously, if it's like a
and there have been
congregational.
initiatives to say, to refuse that. And, just like in America, often we refuse to sit on all male panels and to say that. But even the joke on that early is, they call the congregation or they call the movement and say, we'd like a rabbi. And they get a bit more information, say, oh, it doesn't matter. It can be any rabbi, male, female, as long as they have a long beard. And
Yeah, it's
it doesn't
true.
look like.
Yeah.
And even when I talk to a captain,
yeah,
right, exactly.
my beard's in.
Even
Yeah.
when I always give the example of like, a taxi driver who asks me, about, when he hears that I'm a Reform rabbi, and it's usually him, who asks, and then we talk about God and halakha and mitzvot, and I have to say, wait a second. Here I do have to check my male privilege, because when my female colleagues, say that they're a Reform rabbi, the whole conversation is about gender and not about God and halakha and mitzvot and, sort of the big questions of Jewish existence. It's all about, wait, can women become Reform rabbis? And it's not fair. It's just not fair.
No, but
And
I think, Liz, you mentioned, the need for females in position of leadership. And I think this is definitely true now in Israel. It might be the same in the States, but I'm not sure. The fact that under this government, we have only 5 female ministers and only 1 general manager of a government ministry. Okay. In the previous government, we had 9 female ministers and 9 managers. And it's clear that female voices were not heard. We're now in the middle of a war with Iran. Of course, no women sat around the table that, the decision process. And I think it's clear that people want more females in leadership positions. You mentioned, Josh, the fact that it's, the same goes in Israel. A lot of people would not join now a panel or any discussion which is a male-only panel, and that's amazing, right? That's a really important development.
it's a step, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, no, but I think it's something that people think about, right? People have not thought about it before, and now it's thought about because people want to hear female voices as well. And I want to tell you about one of our struggles against an ultra-Orthodox radio station, which did not allow any women to be heard on air for 2.5 years. And we took them to court and they said, well, once we put women on air, our audience, which is ultra-Orthodox, just want to listen and we'll have to close down the station. And of course, the reality was the complete opposite because Haredim, right, ultra-Orthodox listeners wanted to hear female voices because that's really across the board that people want to hear both male and female voices. And I think in this sense, we see people that are much more liberal in comparison to the leadership, right, which is today completely exclusionary and pushes away female voices and females' opinions.
So I want to build on Orly's point and talk about what women's leadership looks like in the Jewish world today and how you see that, especially rabbinic leadership, especially organizational leadership, and how you see, you and I both sit around the table of the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations, where we see women in positions of leadership in women's organizations, but still not enough in general organizations. So how are you seeing that changing role? I'm thinking about next week or in a few days, depending on when this airs, that we will be at the CCAR convention, the Central Conference of American Rabbis for largely North American rabbis, and we're seeing more and more women fill those roles. How are you seeing that, in this, today?
Yeah, I think the question is well framed and an important one because the idea, which in the States at least gets very tossed around, of a glass ceiling existing is the situation that we're in. Whether it's at the Conference of Presidents that you mentioned, Josh, in different North American organizations that stretch and expand and cover a lot of different members and leaders, or in congregations and communities, we are seeing, thanks to the opening and access of women to pursue higher level professional careers, and of course, in more narrowly in our sphere, for women to become rabbis, and having now several generations of women who could do that, that thinking that more and more women are stepping into leadership roles, but many of those, it's either that they are leading in volunteer capacities, in volunteer roles, or they are leading
as lay leaders, you're saying?
As lay leaders, yes, exactly. Or they're leading up to the highest role, the top position, right? They're in the layer right below the, whether it's the president or the CEO, the top staff, this top professional leader. And there's also a big divide between women who are leading smaller, more boutique organizations and those who are leading the big, giant, multi-million dollar budget organizations. So we still have this gap, and there are, women are struggling to break through in that way. And I think that many folks sort of say, all right, we've made so much progress, but we do still have so much further to go, because what are the societal and bias pressures that are preventing women from breaking through into those top positions? So not everywhere, right? There are, of course, amazing women and leaders that we hold up and we think about at different points who are leading in top positions, but it's still the exception, not the rule.
And I will say, first of all, thank you. I want to Orly point to the reform movement in Israel, which for the first time has the top professional echelon and the top lay leadership, even the director of the Israeli rabbinic program, as well as Iraq, the IMPJ, and the lay leadership are all led by women at this moment, which is something to celebrate.
We have a lot to celebrate on that, and also a lot to learn from you.
I want to ask you, we mentioned briefly the current political moment and the current government, and we see under this government specifically bills which are being pushed by different coalition members that aim to restrict the rights of women, right? We mentioned the Kotel, right? That's something which is very recent, just a couple of weeks ago, a bill that seeks to prevent egalitarian prayer and, of course, prevent prayer by women of the wall and anybody praying in contradiction to the chief rabbinate. But we also saw other bills, such as a bill to expand gender segregation in academic institutions. Today, it's allowed only to some extent. In some institutions, the Supreme Court allowed it in a very restricted manner. Now they really want to allow it anybody to all academic institutions to have gender segregated programs, which are going to affect the ability of female lecturers to teach male students. And we see another very problematic bill, which is a bill to expand the jurisdiction of rabbinical courts to allow them to deal with civil matters. And it's going to affect specifically, not only, mostly women, because obviously it's rabbinical judges or only male judges, and they're going to deal according to the Torah, right, to the Orthodox interpretation of the Torah. And this is going to be very problematic to women's rights. And I want to ask you, how have the priorities of WRJ changed over the last few years since, this government is in power and as we see those really dangerous measures?
Yeah, I think that obviously, and of course, and it just bears mentioning again and again that we're thinking deeply and caring for everyone who is under the immediacy of the stress and the threat of the active conflict and war that's going on now. We pray that, things will be safer and more peaceful even when we share out this conversation. That's the case right in this moment. And just days before this most recent conflict broke out, we had women, not just in Israel, but from around the world, and WRJ was part of helping to galvanize and organize folks to speak up against that Kotel bill and any of those pieces of legislation. And you are always so wonderful about sharing those with us to make sure that we can mobilize our folks to make their voices heard. These are things that, I think the Kotel bill in particular is one that stands out because it's not just about a place in Israel. It is, of course, an extremely holy place, a special place, but it is a place that represents the way in which not only Israelis, but diaspora Jews and women and people from around the world, how they can pray and have religious freedom and religious expression, whether folks want to be participating in a more open and free and inclusive way on the women's side of the Kotel and joining our friends at Women of the Wall, or they want to have access to the egalitarian Kotel. We know that the decisions that are being pushed forward or potentially being made by this government have an impact not only on Israelis, but the way in which Jews from around the world can find their connection to Israel. And in a moment where potentially folks say that is fraying, that is strained, isn't that the exact opposite of what we want to be doing right now, rather than shutting doors and people saying that country and the way that it practices and authenticates my prayer and my traditions and the way that I want to show up is not okay? Like, instead, we want to be opening more doors and having people feel like they can have reasons that when they come to Israel that they feel connected and welcomed and embraced.
Yeah, I'm into that. And let's Let's build on that more a little bit. And how have the events of October 7th and the ensuing war affected you and affected WRJ and your priorities? I know you're very outspoken in terms of specifically the sexual violence that we saw on October 7th, and giving an award to Dr. Kochav Levi El-Kayam for her work and really highlighting that as a specific WRJ priority. Share with us a little bit about how that played out for you.
Yeah, I think, in the very earliest hours of that most terrible day, as a Hebrew speaker, as someone who was following, different personal friends and accounts and things that were coming out, it was very clear that what we were seeing was gender-based and sexual violence, right? And let's sort of leave aside both the trauma and the pain of the hostages and our enduring support for bringing them home. That really also was a uniting force among so many of our leaders and advocates. But even on that day, what we know as over a century-old women's organization is that when people say that there has been gender-based and sexual violence, when there has been rape, when there have been these painful, terrible things, that we believe them, right? That's sort of like that's how we come into the conversation. So we were one of the first organizations in North America to put out a statement saying this has happened, that there has been gender-based and sexual violence on October 7th. And that's just the position that we have been leading from, whether that's taken us to be, lifting up the voices of folks who have survived these traumas, to partnering together with the initiative that Sheryl Sandberg lifted around Screams Before Silence, and sharing those voices, bringing them to speak from a dais at the White House to really authenticate and make sure that the world could hear their voices. And this is something that we know, like even now as we move further away from those peak moments of the initial conflict, that these traumas are going to stay with everyone. And we know that when women say that this has happened to them, when people say this has happened to them, we believe them, full stop.
Yeah, mentioning October 7th and obviously the terrible gender-based violence, what I take from October 7th is really talking about the hostages and how all of the pressure, that we put both in Israel and outside of Israel and the U.S. has made a difference, right? And so for me, it's sort of a conclusion of agency, that we have a lot of power to change things, even when it seems very, very difficult. And as we are nearing the end of this episode, I want to ask you, at this very challenging moment, I think for both of our countries, what gives you hope? And I think I mentioned before that my take on our fights for women's rights is actually very hopeful, in the sense that we brought about a real change, right? Not only we got many women to receive compensation for being discriminated against, but really change the perception. And actually, I take the example of our fight for women's rights and I try to replicate it in other contexts, right? Our fight against racism is much, much more difficult because I feel we haven't done this sort of shift in perspective yet as we did with the issue of women's rights. So what makes you hopeful looking toward the future?
Yes. Despite all what folks might feel is the reality or the right choice, I am always a hopeful and optimistic person. And I think that's first because I get to work with amazing folks like you, and we support each other and lift each other up through the work that we do. I also think I'm hopeful because the loudest voices around Israel, certainly in the US and in North America, are so often the minority, right? But we let the folks who are very far off to say, I have no more relationship with Israel, or, Israel can do no wrong and we have to be supportive no matter what. Those are small minorities, but they often take up all the airspace. But what we know, that the vast majority of folks who are in between those two poles, those are the women and the people that I am meeting and speaking with every day in our broader reform movement. And we're the largest Jewish movement in North American life. So we know that if we're able to connect with these folks who feel a connection to Israel, who feel pride in their Judaism, that the key piece is to go back to the things that shaped my own Zionism, is just to get them to Israel and to have their own experiences. They have been bombarded with headlines and news, and Israel has not left, sort of public consciousness for several years now because of the violence and conflict since October 7th. And many of these moms and women in particular that I'm thinking about have been asked to sort of say, well, tell me what you think. Or, and many of these women, they either haven't been to Israel or haven't been in a long time, then what they really need is the opportunity to come for themselves and to reignite or strengthen that connection. So
If only there was such a program like that.
yes, this fall we WRJ are going to be launching an initiative to bring more women and bring more moms to Israel. It's called Circles, and we're working on a city-based model. So women will join their circle, travel together in October to Israel. We're starting with 6 pilot cities, and I think that based on all the conversations that I've had with folks about this heavily subsidized trip that's just going to make it easy and accessible for moms who we define as women or parents who have kids 18 or under living at home, that they're going to have their own experiences, they're going to have their own connection, and then they're going to be in sisterhood and connection both with Israeli women and with Israelis, and then also with that group of folks when they get back home.
That sounds amazing. And I know that you'll, while there, make lots of connections with our reform movement on the ground there, whether it's different congregations or with Orly and with Anna and the leadership, of course, that will be imagined. How do you see that actually changing, the relationship between Israel and the diaspora? Let me frame it in the following way. I appreciated, sharing some different areas of where you see hope. But I want to ask, what do you hope for? What do you hope to see in the next, whether it's the next year or the next 5 years, going?
Wow. I just, I hope that we can return to a place where to be able to connect on a regular basis, hopefully through folks getting to Israel, that it's a place where you can go and we can talk and really work about the issues that are impacting society. And we're not in this immediate, challenged existential place. And folks can just dive deep into their own relationship and their own connection with Israel and with Israelis. And the same true for Israelis and North American Jews, right? That we can strengthen the ties of Am Yisrael, of peoplehood, but to have that be through the depth of connection and relationships, and have that be something where it's a place where people want to thrive and be there together.
Well, I know that we're
Liz?
all excited to partner with you on all of these things and to see how it plays out. And thank you.
Yeah, for sure, Liz. Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm looking forward to welcoming you in the Circle's mission. And thank you so much for being with us here today. And thank you so much for all your work and for your support. If you found this conversation meaningful, please share it. These are the kind of discussions we need more of: honest, informed, and grounded in reality.
And I want to encourage all of you to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. You could even go in and leave a 5-star review and tell us how meaningful these conversations are to you and how helpful you find them in analyzing and synthesizing the complex world in which we live. So please share and give us a review. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Liz. Bye-bye.
Thank you.